everybody, to Illuminate, Navigate, Radiate, a journey of emotional resilience. I'm your host, Brandon, starting off our June series today, which is going to be a journey through grief. And after our conversation on Monday with Lou and doing the journey segment, I thought this would be a really awesome thing to dive into and just kind of really focus more about grief, how it affects us, how we can support other people in that healing and moving forward process in it. So Lou was very gracious enough to join me and for a couple episodes and do a little grief series and talk about some different aspects of it. So I want to welcome Lou back to the show. And Lou, how you doing today?
I'm very good, thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, no, I'm really grateful that you were on board to do this and jump into it. Even though grief is such a heavy and hard topic, I think being more okay with having these conversations is so important and being a little more open about it. And I know you spoke on that a little bit on Monday as well. So if you haven't watched that, definitely go back and watch it. But I'm excited to, have these conversations with somebody that spends a little more time dealing with grief and focusing on it and some different like perspectives on it. So again, I really appreciate your time. But just to kind of jump into our little series here on grief, I want to ask you, how would you explain grief to somebody? Like if somebody was asking you, what does grief mean? If how would you try to explain what it is?
Ooh, it's a hard one. I would say grief is the emotional, spiritual, physical reaction to loss of any kind. Most people think it's to do with death, but I guess it's anything that we lose that we're not ready for or we don't want. How's that?
No, I think that's a great answer. And with what you do in the grief project and having interactions with people surrounding that, I would imagine, I guess you would interact more around the concept of death and people grieving loss in that way. But are there a lot of people that either reach out or talk to you about the loss of, could be a lifestyle, could be a relationship, could be a friendship, just that loss of other things, not necessarily meaning death?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. Most of it is around death, but I do try and, every now and then just bring up the fact that it's not just about death and dying. It can be anything at all. I mean, I've even had people reach out to me about losing their job that they had for 25 years and that they just feel really lost. They don't know what's next. They've lost their identity. So yeah, it can be anything at all. And like I said, it's not even just, often grief is not just the feeling of losing someone. It's also that it changes you as a person, and it changes your future. I mean, for a lot of people, initially the grief is that missing the person, but then it's also comes into your life in terms of the dreams you had, the plans you had, everything, losing your identity again, who you are without that person or that thing in your life. So yeah, it's really any change that is hard.
Yeah, no, that's like just you saying that, made me like think about a couple different things in my life. Like that last part you just said about like losing dreams or, kind of looking at how I gave up a lot of my dreams and passions when I got into drugs. Like, I was in love with soccer, and I ended up getting a college scholarship to go and play in college. I went to college wanting to be a vet because I loved animals growing up. I wanted to, get back and do some kind of work with animals. And once I started, especially once I started doing heroin and went into harder drugs, like I slowly watched that stuff just not matter anymore. And it really was like a grieving process of, this really sucks because it's something I love, and I feel like I'm losing pieces of me, like stuff that I really identified with growing up, and really before like drugs really took hold of my life. I could see those things mattering less and less each day that passed. So, the more drugs I took, it was just like, yeah, that part of me is gone now. And being in such a negative headspace already and doing drugs all the time, like it just, that was just another reason I could come up with to use. And it was because it was so hard to watch, right? It was so hard because not only
Yeah.
would I see it, but then I'd have like people who were around me point that out, like, oh, what happened to you? You were such a good student, and you were good at this, or you were such a funny person, or like they just point out all these like good things. They'd be like, well, what happened to you? And it
Yeah.
was, and so like processing that really was kind of like grieving losing. I know on Monday I kind of talked about like eventually giving up drugs and grieving that part of it, but thinking about how painful that was to lose everything else that I stood for that was positive.
Yeah.
That was a really hard grieving process to go through.
Yeah, it's huge. How have you processed that? And like, obviously, I mean, people saying that you changed as well. That's like, there's a lot of shame in there too, I
Mhm.
guess, for you of like, oh,
Just a little bit.
yeah. um, yeah. How do you feel about that now? Like, you've come to peace with that?
Oh yeah, yeah, and it was like, once I got clean, I found like my passion for soccer kind of got reignited through coaching, and I didn't have a competitive headspace anymore to like go and play, but I really fell in love with the coaching aspect of it, so that was kind of reignited, and then it was, you know, I was way more interested in like psychology aspect of things, mental health aspect of things once I came
Yeah.
out of that. So I did a lot of stuff that surrounded that. And even though
Yeah.
like just, the end of the year last year, I lost my job of working with kids and talking about mental health issues, and I gave up soccer. I gave up coaching.
Yeah.
And that's because I was at a place in my life where I felt like I really needed a change, and I was letting that stuff identify me too much. And so I needed to like really kind of take some time and find some peace with myself, and be okay with who I am, and not like, well, I'm this or I'm that. I wanted to feel okay saying I'm just me. And this is what I've done. So it's been,
Yeah.
it's been a long journey of like changing parts of my life, letting those go, grieving them a little bit, and feeling that pain from letting something go that you've done for so long. But it's something that I've definitely gotten better at as time goes on, because I can understand like, okay, I gotta feel this, I gotta understand it, I gotta be gracious with why I'm upset, why I'm sad, and then I
Yeah.
gotta I gotta take that next step forward so I don't sit here and get stuck for the next year of my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's just that really, it's that process of going through it. And something else about the process that I wanted to ask you about, because I know I'd sent you a message and you're like, yeah, that's actually not, wasn't it meant for grief, it was meant for death. So you hear the 5 stages of grief all the time. And when you said that, that kind of like blew my mind a little bit, because I never, I've always heard it as like, these are the stages of grief. And even after you said that, I Googled that, and that comes up all, in all these different ways, all these different things. And so I thought that was interesting. So I was wondering if you could just like kind of talk about that in those stages, and how that was intended for death, and how it might be a little bit different, I guess, with grief. And then maybe we'll mention what those 5 stages are.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it is really interesting because I remember when my mum died and I was talking to a girlfriend on the phone and she said to me, "Oh, Well, I guess now you've just got to go through the 5 stages of grief and you'll be okay. And I was like, yeah, Googled them and was like, okay, I've just got to go boom, 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 boom. And then I'm out the other side. Um, but what I have learned since then is, so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is the lady that came up with the 5 stages of grief. She was, she's passed now, but she was a really incredible lady who worked with people who were terminal, basically. She did a lot of hospice work and stuff like that. So I don't know where it all changed, but her 5 stages were actually from her studying people that were terminally ill and speaking with them about how they were feeling about their impending death. So somewhere down the road, it got switched to grief. And it's really controversial now because a lot of people just poo-poo the whole concept and say it wasn't for that and it doesn't work for grief. I personally think that it still intermingles with grief. Like, you do go through stages. It's just that I think we as humans made it all linear and like, oh, you have to go through anger, then depression, then sadness, but it's all over the shop, like you can initially, when someone passes, you can be in denial for a while, just going, I can't get my head around the concept that that person's gone. And it does, but then you can go back to that 6 months later, it's not a parallel line that you just sit on and go through these stages. So yeah, it is really interesting. And I know that, she did a lot of work towards the end of her life with David Kessler, who I did the course through, and they came up with a 6th stage as well, which is honoring your person, which is a really cool one actually, because it's like, I guess some people call it integration. Once you kind of integrate your grief into your life, how you honor that person is also really important, for the rest of your life. So, I mean, some people will, start a foundation, for example, and that's how they honor their person. For some people, it's really personal, and it's just that they light a candle once a year on their anniversary or their birthday or whatever. I love hearing those stories, though, of how people honor their person, because it's really cool how we all somehow integrate it back into our lives, so they're still with us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I would say just like my experiences from it, it's definitely not so much like a set stage, right? Like, and I want to ask you about your experience with it in a minute, but it's not like you have to go through it this way, and it's not like that, like staircase basically, to where, like you said, then you come out the other side of it. And I know, like for me, I'm not very angry person, so I like, even when I'm grieving, I don't have too many moments or too long of moments of like being angry about the situation. I definitely experience the sadness or depression aspect of it, probably the heaviest.
Yeah.
And so I think understanding like how you process those things is important as well, because it doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna hit each stage the exact same. Like, I'm definitely gonna spend more time in that sadness, depression aspect of it than I am
Yeah.
maybe anger, or maybe I'm better at acceptance than denial, or however it kind of works for me. But like, when, like, kind of like you just shared that story of I got to go through the 5 stages and then I'll be okay. When you looked at those and started to understand them, how did they look for you in that process of the loss of your mom, and how did you kind of go through those stages, and what did that kind of look like for you?
Yeah, it was really messy. I think I did really sit in, probably, the beginning of it. So the 5 stages are denial, bargaining, anger, depression, sadness, and acceptance. And then the 6th one is honoring. So for me, I sat for a long time in the denial and bargaining. It's crazy how, you know, our brains work. I think that's a big part of it too. Is, I mean, we all think that we have control over our grief and that we can just, push through, but there's this amazing book called The Grieving Brain, which changed everything for me in terms of my own kind of self-hatred over how much I was grieving. And it really is a scientific book about our brains and what happens when we do have great loss and what our brains do. So because our brains have maps, it's all mapped of, for example, at 6 o'clock at night, that door is going to open and that person that you love is behind the door. Once they pass, our brains haven't changed the map yet. So it's like what people say about you go to call someone, like for so long, I always would call my mom. I used to do a lot of markets and sell my products at markets, and I would always call my mum on the way home from a market. And after she passed, I got in the car one day and all packed up, and I just went to call her, and it was like, she's not here, So that's our brains doing what it does. Sorry, I've gone a bit off track there.
No,
But
no, that was a good analogy, though. A good example of
yeah,
that.
so for me, I sat in denial and bargaining for quite a while, and just like the bargaining is bizarre too, because we know that we can't get them back, but somehow, you make wishes, you kind of do these things in your head like, oh, if I could just have one more day with them, I would do this, and it will never happen, but it's a bizarre thing that we do. The anger for me, a bit like you, I don't really tap into anger a lot, but I did struggle early on with, like, I guess, jealousy a little bit more than anger. I felt really jealous of my friends that still had their mums, um, and yeah, that was a really interesting part of it for me, where I was like, what is wrong with me? Why am I like it really sat yucky with me. I didn't like that feeling of just, yeah, just thinking, why don't I get to have that? Why do they get to have that? Why do some, and friends of mine that are, don't really care either, they're just, that whole thing of like, oh, my mum's calling me again, and it's like, just like, embrace that while you've got it, because when it's gone, it's gone. um and then, obviously, I mean, definitely I felt the depression, sadness part. It just really, yeah, like I said to you on Monday, I just got to a point where I just felt like nothing mattered. I just didn't care anymore, which I guess is part of that depression thing. And then acceptance, yeah, it just comes with time. And I think because I had these cumulative losses, it was kind of piling up. It did mess it up a lot too. It didn't feel linear in any way. And, as things kept happening, I just really lost a lot of faith. So, yeah, those stages were all over the shop. And yeah, yeah, I think they're a good basis for people. I think if you know nothing about grief and you're first in grief, just reading about the stages can help you sort of start to identify where you might sit. And, some people don't ever get to anger. Some people don't ever get the depression. It's so different for everyone. Some people just get the depression and sit in that for a long time.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and I like what you just said. It's just like it can be a really good understanding for people, right?
Yes.
To like realize that what you're feeling and what you're processing um isn't crazy. It isn't, like the bargaining thing. I think
Yeah.
if we didn't understand that and we're sitting there and we're just constantly wishing, oh, I wish I could have done this, or just give me one more day, or just give me one more, message with that person. And let me say something just a little bit different, and maybe that changes some type of outcome. Um, but I think like when we sit there and do that, especially for we haven't experienced it too much, or we're not talking about it, that can make us feel crazy. Right, that can make us just like there's so much on us. And so I think like what you said with just kind of reading it and understanding it, that these are different things you could go through, right? these
Yes.
are these are different things that could happen, and then understanding what that might look like for you and that it might be a little bit different. It might, like you just said, you might not hit that stage at all. Or, it might just be very brief. It might be very, I guess, underwhelming where it doesn't hit you as strongly. Uh, but it's good to be able to identify those things and understand, like, especially with grief, because I would say grief is one of the biggest things that we go through in life, and processing grief can be one of the biggest things to process
Yeah.
as we go through life. And so I think it's so important to just have some understanding with it, and then also have that being okay to share those things and to say those things and to kind of, however you need to do that, whether it's just saying you miss that person, whether it's talking about great moments with that person, whether it's just, even if it's not a person, just reflecting on the good of something or the bad of something to be able to help you start to move forward and get to that level of acceptance. Although I wanna ask you about that one specifically real quick with acceptance, because I hate that one. It almost
Yeah.
feels like it's final that finalization, right, of everything, whether it's grieving a job, a lifestyle, or person. It's like that
Yeah.
finalization of saying, okay, this happened. Now I have to keep moving, because that's kind of just what life does. It keeps moving.
Yeah.
Have you experienced acceptance in a way of like it comes and goes? Has it been, was that something that took just a really long time? Maybe it even hasn't completely happened for some of the loss that you experienced, but how has that one specifically looked, with different aspects that you have faced with grief?
Yeah. It's acceptance is, yeah, it's the hard one, I reckon. And it comes and goes for me. I mean, I've accepted my mother's never coming back. Obviously, she's 7 years gone now, and I think though with the acceptance as well, it's not just the acceptance of the death; it's the acceptance of all of it. It's the acceptance of what the relationship was, your regrets that you might have. Um, there's so much interweaved in acceptance that, and for a lot of people, some people never get to the acceptance part. I think some people see acceptance as the same as saying it's okay. And it doesn't mean that it's ever okay. I mean, I've received messages and things from people saying, I will never accept that my child died. It will never be okay. And it's like, no, it'll never be okay. It doesn't make it okay, but it's about accepting it into your life and then integrating that into your life. If we keep them separate, it doesn't mesh. It's hard to keep moving when you've got that there and your life here. But once you start to interweave them and you allow the grief and you accept that it is going to come and go, it's always probably going to be there on some level. That's to me the acceptance, just accepting that it's going to be a part of your life now. And it does, and you're a different person once you've been through this stuff. And I think as well, for me anyway, there was a lot in the acceptance of forgiving myself for things as well. I think, um, yeah, like I said, my mum and I, we had a really complicated relationship, and towards the end it was just love and it was good, thank God. We weren't in a bad space when she passed, but once she was gone, it brought up a lot of stuff for me in terms of our previous relationship, the times I punished her. And yeah, there's two people in every relationship, but yeah, I had to really work on forgiving myself for some of my behaviors, for wasting time. And yeah, same with my marriage. There was a lot that I was really angry about, but I also had to forgive myself because I kind of blamed myself for a lot of things that I'd accepted. And yeah, took a long time for me to get to that place though. I was very angry at myself for, yeah, a lot of things. So yeah, And that was like, one of the best things for me. And that was someone said to me, write a letter to yourself. And it's really amazing when you actually write a letter to yourself and forgive yourself, how it shifts things as well. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I looking at those, the things you just talked about, especially with like the loss of your mom and the loss of your marriage, and talking about how like it's a little bit different for each one. And that I think that's important to understand too, right? Is that like
Yeah.
again isn't just like, especially if it was a long marriage, if there's kids involved in that marriage, if there's that there's so many things that go into that relationship that make it even harder to process at times that it's
Yeah.
over. um and so I think that that's an important aspect of it. But with the you know with the writing a letter to yourself, that was a big thing I did in rehab,
Yeah.
because I felt a lot of guilt and shame over my friend passing,
Yeah.
and it's just circumstances throughout my life that I looked at and I was like, that led to that moment, that led to that happening, and so there was a lot to that. But like you said, if you the longer I held it over here and, just tried to separate it from my life, it made that a lot harder to process. And that's why when I got clean, it was like, you know, that was one of the first things I wanted to jump into, because I need to figure out how to live life and still carry that, like, that pain, those memories, the just everything that went with that, right? That went with
Yeah.
that loss.
Yeah.
And that can be, I would say that can be a really good practice, not only into yourself, but if you're struggling with the loss of somebody and they're gone and you can't say that to them, just writing, a goodbye letter to them or a thank you letter to them, or just letting them know that impact, getting those words out in some way,
Yeah.
can be really powerful, emotional, but very powerful tool in, I want to say, that acceptance process of, okay, this is part of my life now. I understand I'm going to be different because of this. And just because I'm accepting, like you just said, doesn't make it okay, doesn't make it any less painful or any less impactful. But this is how I'm going to carry this, but also still make my life manageable.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. It's just so, it is so complex. And like I said the other day, I think it's so important that we bring everything back to simplicity and just try and be so kind to ourselves, because I don't think we're that kind to ourselves in general life. We push ourselves, we try to be driven, we're all trying to achieve and succeed. And when you lose something that really alters you, um, it's really important to take a step back and sit with it and forgive ourselves and work through all that stuff, because if we don't, it just keeps getting messier. So yeah, the letter writing is amazing. I mean, I that's been a big process for me, writing letters. I've written 100 letters to my ex-husband, that he'll never receive, but
Yeah.
it helped me process, and I wrote a lot of letters to my mum in the early days too, just to, and you're right, it just gets it out of your body and it shifts things. And um, I think, with all of it, that's what's important, is that we don't stay in any one emotion for too long. Like, as much as I say, your timeline's your own and it's different for everyone. But I think with grief, if we just sit in sadness for too long, it can really hold us back. If we sit in anger for too long, and I think that's the thing. With grief, you've got to really tune into yourself, really listen to your body and see what's happening, and make sure that, if you do feel like you're stuck in one emotion, I think that's when you need to get some help. But if the emotions keep moving and changing, it's a lot healthier.
Yeah, no, and I love that you said that, because I really as you know, as much as we try to understand grief and talk about grief and open up these different ways to handle it, I think it really, a big part of that is really accepting that it is your own process, especially with something like grief. Like, you really have to be okay with understanding that you have to, like, figure out what's gonna work for you, how it's gonna happen for you. And you might need some guidance and you might need some help, and I think that's really important. But trying to grieve, if I try to grieve the way you grieve, that's probably not going to work well for me. Or, like you just said, if I let that grief take over, that's where it becomes detrimental to me. Like, I have sat in grief of that sadness and that depression, um, and I I throw away other things in my life because I'm sitting in that, and I let other things go by, and I let other relationships slip away, or with the denial aspect of it, then, or the bargaining aspect of it, then it becomes, there's some shame and guilt that starts getting too much as I'm
Yeah.
as I'm sitting in that, and so then I start making destructive decisions because I need to figure out a way how to get my mind off those things and
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
think about those things. So I think that is a huge part about it, and where you know, it really is okay to feel those things, and it's okay to speak about them and get help or guidance with them.
Yeah.
But the simplicity of being kind to yourself through that process is so important because, like you said, we're in a world that is so fast paced. We don't even give ourselves time to process anything,
Yeah.
um, and and eventually, from my experience, eventually that catches up, and eventually
Yeah.
that becomes a bigger negative thing in the future.
Yeah.
And so I've really learned to take time to process even small things, just something small that happened throughout the day, something that was said, something that just threw me off a little bit. And so when I have to take time to just process those little things, that just shows, like, with something as heavy and as big as grief, you really have to be okay and be kind to yourself to process such a heavy, big thing, and find your way through that.
Yeah. And there's a thought, like there are people out there that call themselves grief experts, right? And I really struggle with that because I kind of go, none of us can be an expert on grief because it is so completely different for everyone. But you can be an expert on your own grief, right? So that's the thing. Like, we need to, with grief, you really need to tune into yourself, and trying to follow someone else's rules just doesn't work. It's because every relationship's so different. We all have our baggage, we all have our traumas. So yeah, it can be just so different for everyone. And yeah, and again, those stages and everything. I mean, some people skip through 4 of them and just sit in one, and yeah. But uh, yeah, I've lost my train of thought. I don't know where I was going.
Yeah, that'll happen sometimes, but I do like that you said just being an expert on your own grief. I think, in just having lots of conversations with people about lots of different things, going through addiction myself and some other mental health issues. I think that those whole processes of just trying to grow and understand life and be, however we define happy or successful, be able to become those things, and that's being an expert in yourself, right? And
Yeah,
that comes with grief, that comes with mental health, that comes with what's going to make you happy, the things that are destructive to you, and being able to do that is so important to hit that. And I think we're always looking for an answer or a quick fix, right? This is the
yes,
world of quick fixes. So it's like, oh, I'm grieving. Tell me how to get over it so I can move on and continue chasing
yeah,
whatever it is I'm chasing. And that's
yeah.
what we get messed up as we go.
So true. And like with grief as well, I find that when people talk about early grief, a lot of people think that's like 3 months, early grief is first 3 months.
Mm.
But grief and time is such a weird thing because in some ways, you kind of in like that first year after you lose someone, there's all these milestones. There's their birthday, there's the first Christmas without them, first Easter, whatever it is, all your birthdays without them there, the whole family unit changes, all of that. And I think because of the way our society runs and we are so fast, I just feel like I'm always saying to people, people will message me and say, I lost my dad 4 months ago and I'm just not coping. And I'm like, of course you're not. 4 months is nothing in grief, for me, in my expert opinion, I would say early grief is kind of the first 2 years, and then you kind of, after you've done 2 years, things start to sort of, well, they did for me anyway, different for everyone again, but it started to, sit. It all started to kind of sit better. But yeah, we expect to be better so quickly, and people expect us to be better so quickly. That's the thing. And a lot of people just pretend they're fine. They kind of sit in it for a few months and then they go, oh, well, everyone else expects me to be okay. So they just pretend they're okay. I went through that for a bit, just putting on the happy face because you just start to feel like you're a real drain around people. Which is kind of why I started the grief project because, yeah, yeah, you got to get it out somehow.
Yeah, no, and when you look at that, and I think that's why it's important to be kind. When you look at losing somebody in your life, or losing something that was such a big part of you, if you're losing a parent, then you're losing somebody that's literally been a part of your life your entire life. And to think
Yeah,
that, say if I lost my parents, I'm 34 right now, and that's 34 years of my life that's something I'm used to having, something I'm used to being there. Um, to expect myself to process that in 2 months, 4 months, a
yeah,
year, that's so, that's so.
yeah,
It seems like a long time, but it also doesn't when you compare it to the time you had with that person or the time you were
yeah,
in, you know.
exactly.
And
Yeah,
so I think that being kind and just understanding, and then being authentic in it. Like I know, people have that thing where they just ask you how they're doing, how you're doing. And they don't really care to hear how you're truly doing. But if you're struggling, find somebody to say that to, that does want to listen, or does truly care to hear how you're doing, because it's so important to be authentic in that stuff. Because I know at times when people have asked how I was doing, and I so badly wanted to say I am feeling like shit. I'm the shittiest I've been in a long time. I'm depressed, and I want to unload all this stuff on you right now. But I told
yeah,
myself not to. And then once I said that to one person, it was a lot easier to say it to the next person that asked me if I was fine. And so then I just
yeah,
held it in more and more, because it became okay for me to just say, "Oh, I'm fine," and they're not going to ask a follow-up question, so then I can just ignore it a little bit longer.
yeah, yeah. I when my marriage broke down, I told one friend and no one else for a whole year, and just walked around. I don't know. Now I'm just like, how did I do that? Why did I do that? It was very bizarre. I think it's because we were still in lockdown in Melbourne, and I just felt like everyone had so much going on
Mhm.
themselves. But I had a lot of shame around it and a lot of just, yeah, I was really embarrassed by the whole situation. So I didn't even tell, like, my sister is my best friend in the world, and I couldn't tell her. I just was, so it was such a bizarre thing because I was like turning up to work, I was doing all the things, and just holding it in all day. But, as I'd be walking to my car, I'd just be crying. It was just crazy when I think about it now that I just held it all in. But yeah, we do these things that just to protect ourselves, I guess. And I just knew that I needed to work it out on my own. It was one of those situations where I I rely pretty heavily on my friends and family for, their opinions and things. I've always been a bit of a people pleaser, so I really felt in that moment like I needed to be really clear with how I felt about it. But yeah, I look back and just go, God, we're crazy humans. Like the things we do to ourselves to make it more complex.
100%.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
grief is one of those things where we can really complicate it and overthink it and let it really take control in different ways. And and just kind of to wrap up, I really think that's why after having that conversation with you on Monday, I thought this would be a really cool thing just to dive into in some different ways and just become a little bit more knowledgeable, just for myself too, of some different perspectives, being able to relate on some of those things I think is always really big and important. So again, thank you, Lou, for jumping on and doing this. I'm looking forward to meeting with you a couple more times to go in some
yep.
other aspects of grief. So yeah, so thank you again for joining and diving into this like little intro of it, and I'm looking forward to the next couple ones as well.
Yeah, me too. No problem at all. I can't believe we've been 49 minutes already. Feels like we just started.
I know it goes when it's just when you're having good conversation and especially when it's really interesting. I feel like it just like it flies by, right, with the conversation. But
Yeah, for
don't
sure.
worry, we still got a couple more hours we can conversate about and have some good back and forth on it. So
Yeah.
definitely go check Lou out at the Grief Project. Thank you for joining and listening. We're looking forward to seeing you back next Friday as well. So it's been Illuminate, Navigate, Radiate. Have a great rest of your day.